SJ, Stongo, Gary Fife, Jahu Jeffkados, Emvpanayv here today. This is another chapter in our new book here. We're going podcast. And you can catch our program later on the Mvskoke Media website on YouTube. Our guest this morning is Joannie Suina, and I still hope I pronounced that correctly, Cochiti Pueblo woman who is, what is your position with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition? Are you with me, Joannie?
Is she still on the line?
I don't know, Ms. Suina, are you still with us?
No, let's try to reconnect with her.
Okay, we're going to try and reconnect her.
Let me pop the...
SJ, Stongo, Gary Fife, Jahu Jeffkados, Emvpanayv here today. We've got another topic that we like to discuss on a national basis here today. Our guest this morning is Joannie Suina, who is with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She's a Pueblo, Cochiti Pueblo woman, and what's your title there, Joannie?
Hi, good morning, Goetzi Hopa. I'm Dr. Joannie Suina, and I serve as the Interim Communications Director at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS for short.
Okay, yeah, the short version would be useful. That's quite a name there. Now, we are looking at the report Interior did, was last spring of last year, regarding the status of boarding schools across Native America. Now, that's a story that's always been somewhat sad. Families being broken up, children separated from their parents. Some of them didn't do well and tried to go home, but didn't make it. Now, it's left, I guess, a scar on the hearts of Native America across the country, but some people say they did just fine. Both of my parents went to a boarding school here in Oklahoma and never really talked about it very much, so we have some limited experience with it, but that's not been the story for the majority of Native children. Now, what is it that is your mission there? What are you trying to share?
So our mission at NABS is to bring truth, justice, and healing, and to shed light on the federal Indian boarding school policy here in the United States. And we work collaboratively with tribes and individual survivors and their descendants. And personally, I'm also a descendant of survivors who attended places like Carlisle Indian Industrial School and Santa Fe and Albuquerque Indian schools.
Mm-hmm. Two of the better known boarding schools that have taken Indian students. Now, in your research and your experience, what has been the story of Indian boarding schools? Is it something that's pretty sad, something that some people, I assume, can be proud of or enjoyed? What's your take on the topic?
Well, when we look at federal Indian policy as a snapshot in this country and understand the various layers that have created ripple effects of intergenerational trauma, which we're still trying to heal from today, we know that when they couldn't terminate us and couldn't remove us, they then, as in the federal government, turned to assimilation. And that meant the creation of these boarding schools beginning as early as the 1800s and running into the 1970s. And today we see a very different version of those, which are tribally controlled BIE schools, and those schools are models of reclaiming our children through education and language. My research specifically has focused on an assessment of that intergenerational trauma with individuals who've attended some of these boarding schools that were directly connected to cultural assimilation of American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian children by forcibly removing them from their families, their communities, stripping them of their languages, their traditional Native religions and cultural beliefs. And what we know through our research and through the stories of our survivors is that these children endured many forms of abuse, including physical, sexual, cultural, and in many instances did not return home from school either. And so when we look at the long-term outcome for our Native communities to be able to continue our traditional ways of knowing, to fully thrive in our languages and our life ways, it's important to acknowledge that this is a painful part of our history that we need to heal from. And that's why we do the work that we do. We want to honor our survivors.
Survivor is a key term there. You outlined a number of kinds of abuse that our people have endured. It was all, what's that phrase, to get rid of the Indian and keep the individual. I forget the exact wording of that phrase, but in other words, to make us a dark-skinned white kid, right?
Correct. So Richard Henry Pratt, who's the mastermind Army colonel, devised this blueprint for the first school, which was Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the intention behind curriculum and the processes which the children went through when they arrived at school, from very harsh corporal punishment to extreme cases where children were not only being bathed in lye and kerosene to supposedly cleanse them of the things and where they came from ultimately. And I think metaphorically, when we look at it in that way, you know, the intent behind the motto of Colonel Pratt was kill the Indian, save the man.
Right.
And that's really what the goal was with the boarding schools.
Now that goal, I don't think was quite as successful as they had intended. It's my experience in talking with people who have been to boarding schools. It was more of a matter of survival and getting past the stuff they were forcing on us, and trying to remain Native in heart and soul and sanity, I think, and overcome and adapt.
Hey, Gary,
Yes.
we have a question from the chat, if you're ready for one.
Right, we've got a question here.
What is the position of NAABSHC on the Catholic Charter School being approved by the Oklahoma Virtual Charter School Board specifically, and sectarian participation in public schools in general?
Did you get that question?
I did. That's something that I'm not able to comment on at this time. I'm not aware of it, but I would love to do some more research and share my perspective at some later time.
Now, the religious schools played a huge part in this situation. We hear a lot of stories of perhaps priests or nuns abusing the students in some fashion. you mentioned a lot of different areas earlier, but the church has to be guilty in complicity in this situation, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And we definitely saw that during the papal apology tour in Canada among our First Nations relatives. And we saw that earlier this year with the rescinding of the doctrine of discovery. So I think those are indicators that the Catholic Church knows that it has blood on its hands.
Mm-hmm. And the Pope has made a couple of statements regarding an apology or taking responsibility. Is that right?
Yeah, so in 2021, Pope Francis embarked on this apology tour across First Nations territories, the first stop being in Mvskoke, Alberta, Canada. I actually had the honor of being present and standing arm in arm with our First Nations relatives. And during that first gathering with survivors, residential school survivors and advocates and folks coming together in solidarity, Pope Francis mentioned the physical abuse, cultural abuse, but he really didn't call out what it has been, which is the sexual, emotional abuse, and really looking at it from the perspective of this was a genocide. This was an attempted genocide, and we've seen the same model of settler colonial impacts being utilized as a tool against Indigenous peoples all across this continent.
The story that I've got with me here today talks about the initiatives, and particularly NABS has joined with the Interior Department in releasing a federal Indian boarding school initiative report. Now, what has been your reaction to seeing that report and the material and information that Interior Department has put forward?
Yeah, great question, Gary. Well, I definitely believe that it continues to be a very historic moment. It continues to reaffirm and acknowledge the stories that many of us grew up with, hearing from our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and our relatives about the truth about our people, that our elders and our ancestors went through so much at the hands of the federal government and these religious institutions. And in realizing that through stories, we know that the impacts of these boarding schools are still with us today. And so being able to collaborate alongside of the Interior, I think it really goes to show that the government and Secretary Holland's office is eager to continue to support and uplift this work, and it's urgent, and we must continue to advance forward with it.
Now, Secretary Deb Haaland's presence at the Interior Department was such a breakthrough for Native people and gave a lot of encouragement to us in believing that we would have our issues discussed in a more thorough and useful manner. Now, does this report that's been highlighted by the Secretary go far enough? Does it cover enough material there to make people realize the futility of the school system or the abuse that went on there? I mean, is it enough?
Well, I think, because this topic is so heavy and we know that many discoveries continue to be made daily, including our growing list of the number of schools that we know of here in the United States has continued to grow. And back in August, we released an updated list of 523 Indian boarding schools total that we have discovered through our research here in the United States. And what we know is that 408 of those were federally funded from 1819 to 1969. And volume 1 of the Interior Report has so many touchstones that are critical to continue to engage and demonstrate that urgency for the federal government, for tribal nations, and for organizations like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition to continue to lead in this movement. Because the majority of what we know, even though we have a listing of these schools that continues to grow, is that we don't have access to individual records. And right now, we're also building out our Indian school database, which is a digital archive that will be released later on in the spring. And it connects to all of the national archives and various other partner organizations that we've collaborated with in being able to look at our relatives' school records, from images to publications. It's very extensive. And so I feel the next steps of this collaboration that we've embarked on with the Interior is to go directly to our survivors and to hear their testimonies, to hear their stories, and to sit with them and to honor their experiences, and also to give them hope so that they can find that healing that they need along this journey.
Now, has that forum ever been arranged? Has it taken place? Is there a one on the plans for the future? Do you know anything about that?
Well, NABS has been working on our own oral history project for quite a while, and we've met with folks in Tulalip several months ago and have continued to listen to stories at every event that we've attended, whether it's tabling at a conference or in our daily travels, attending meetings and hearing our survivors, and even just stories within our own families that are brought forward. And I think that this is such an ongoing, unprecedented effort by the DOI to continue to support this work. And because we've built that trust with American Indian and Alaska Native communities, with tribal nations, and we have experience in collecting survivors' stories in a way that is not only healing informed, but it also helps to uplift them and, again, to find that healing component.
Gary,
Yes.
some questions.
Okay, we've got another question here.
What is the position of this group regarding the role of sectarian institutions in sexual abuse scandals contributing to high rates of murdered, missing Indigenous people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I definitely feel like all of the movements that we've seen with our people being taken and forcibly removed, it's all connected. And we know specifically that for MMIW, MMIR, MMIP, that our children who were forcibly removed from their homes and their tribal nations and taken to boarding school, they are examples of some of our first relatives who have become missing and murdered. So we definitely want to continue to uplift the work of our brothers and sisters who are alongside of us fighting the same fight.
Got one more question, Gary. How has the legacy of boarding schools left a climate and culture of Indigenous populations susceptible and vulnerable, victimized at almost unmitigated levels to this day?
Can you repeat the last part of the question?
Well, the last part, I'm just going to do the whole thing again. How has the legacy of boarding schools left a climate and culture of indigenous populations susceptible and vulnerable, victimized at almost unmitigated levels to this day? How has the legacy created that situation?
I definitely feel like that question has many layers to it, but I'll take what I can from my own research and experience in working with tribal nations and being a proud mother of 4 children who is very conscientious and goal-oriented when it comes to culture and language and immersing my children in spaces and places and having them with Indigenous kinship circles where they can not only fully thrive but learn our traditional ways of knowing. And what we've seen from the legacy of boarding schools is that we know that was an attempt to dismantle Native families, to dismantle Native communities, and really to dismantle tribal nations as a whole. And we know that that was not successful because today there are so many beautiful ways that we share our indigeneity, that we come together as relatives of all nations to advocate alongside of each other, to find healing, to support and uplift one another. And the work that we do at NABS also is about visioning Indigenous cultural sovereignty, that we may continue to take part in our traditional ways of knowing and carry this on as we have for time immemorial.
Jody, let me ask you a question. It's going to get a bit personal, I think. Are you aware of any criminal proceedings that have come out in this because of this report, or somewhere along the line, someone prosecuting an administrator or a church official because of some of the crimes that we've learned of?
Great question, Gary. Well, specifically in New Mexico, looking at some of the schools that are on our listing for the state, and I forgot to mention that I'm coming to you today from Tiwa Territory, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I do know of allegations that are out there, but that's from the personal level. And then from the organizational level, that's something that continues to be investigated, and data and research continue to be conducted on those matters. In regard to our First Nations relatives in Canada and looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, their findings detail exactly that, and that is why it is so critical that here in the States we continue to express this urgency for Senate Bill 1723 to be passed, which is an act to establish a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policies. And as a part of the act, we would then be able to further determine and develop recommendations to understand where, one, our relatives are located, including unmarked graves, and support those reparation or repatriation efforts. And then also to continue to look at what kinds of supports need to be in place to support our relatives in their healing.
Now, you mentioned unmarked graves there, and that was actually where I was going with the next question. Now, I think North America was shocked. It was a year ago, perhaps a little longer, when hundreds of unmarked graves were being uncovered on the grounds of these Canadian schools. I think the number was at least 250 or so like that, and that struck the hearts of people all through Native America. And I think the most poignant reaction was a Native man who was asked to sing the Canadian national anthem, "O Canada," and standing right behind him was an elderly man holding feathers and sage, and an elderly Native woman with a pair of baby moccasins. And I swear to God, everyone I know of got misty-eyed, and perhaps a few tears were being shed while that was being sung. Now, were you aware of that situation, and has it sort of reoccurred somewhere else, particularly when we talk about unmarked Native children's graves?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Gary. The tragedy at Kamloops and the discovery of 215 children, and that number obviously continued to grow and grow, but it's really that painful reminder of the continued human rights violations that have occurred at hundreds of residential schools as well as Indian boarding schools here in the States, run by the federal government and churches. And what we know is that these are reoccurring soul wounds, and that's exactly why we seek that truth, justice, and healing through the work that we do at NABS. And we also know that the Indian boarding school era has been an integral part of that blueprint that I was describing earlier, as a part of a centuries-long systematic and genocidal campaign by the United States to erase Native peoples, our cultures, and really our civilizations. And looking at the ways that this effort has centered such widespread violence, it continues to demonstrate that the work and the research of NABS and other scholars over the years have continued to bring light to these children who did not return home. And one of the things that really struck me in visiting Mvskoke during the People Apology Tour was a very iconic image that continues to be utilized today, and it's a picture of some Native children, and it says, "And then they whispered that they found us." And so I think, at the heart of what we do, we know we do it for our ancestors, and it's their continued prayers that guide our work and help to bring light these atrocities.
The last couple of years have seen actually the return of the remains of several of these children to their tribes of origin. I believe the Lakotas got a couple, and then there were other tribes that I don't quite recall. Is that going to be enough? Is that the right path to take in healing this problem?
Well, I think it really needs to be evaluated on a tribal nation to tribal nation level, because each respective nation has its own ways of working with our relatives in terms of repatriation. And when we look at the continued opportunity for healing and the outlook of the future, especially within this partnership with the DOI and our oral history focuses, bringing light to survivor testimony is one of the first steps. Repatriation and identification of unmarked graves is one of the first steps. And gaining access to their records to our relatives' records, to which schools they attended, how long they stayed, is all critical to this movement because we deserve to know, and that's why we demand justice.
In recent weeks, there have been amendments to the Native American Graves Repatriation Act in order to make the return of remains and funerary objects easier. Is that the light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps?
I think that the continued movement that we have made are definitely great strides, and in terms of updates to NAGPRA, our people and our cultural artifacts, they deserve to come home to the places where that spirit is being carried, and our present folks who are uplifting these movements and our future generations, they deserve that piece to be honored as well. So yes, I definitely feel it's a movement in the right direction.
Great. Now, this last question, I think, certainly does go to a personal level. And now I want to ask you if how you felt. How has it affected you into dealing with a subject that's so emotional and so strong? Does it hurt? I mean, has it affected you and or your family?
Wonderful question, Gary. And for me, this is my heart work. I am extremely passionate about bringing truth, justice, and healing around federal Indian boarding schools and the intergenerational effects that we see today so that we can find peace, we can find healing. I actually dedicated my research study as a doctoral student at the University of Washington, Tacoma, to specifically this topic and looking at Native women who are leading healing efforts. And what I can say from a personal level as well is that being within this work, being a part of different movements, whether it's addressing the violence that we see in our communities, whether it's uplifting missing relatives and trying to find and assist families with locating their loved ones, or directly within this work around boarding schools, this is a great spiritual calling, and continuing to carry out this work we know has a lot of emotional toll, emotional labor, but it is through those continued prayers of our ancestors that reverberate in our everyday lives, through who we work with, the tribal nations that we support and uplift, and our survivors' stories. And I definitely attribute my continued work in this movement to prayers that I carried to Carlisle many years ago when I visited some of my own relatives' graves there at the present-day Army War College, or what was previously known as Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And so holding those truths as we know them and practicing my traditional Pueblo ways of connecting earth world work to spirit world is what I keep at the forefront in my daily life, because this is not just a job for me. It is, like I said, my heart work, and it's something that I know is going to be a lifelong pursuit to ensure that my children and my grandchildren and future generations can not only be proud of who they are as Native people, but can continue to fully thrive in Native America.
Joannie, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. Hang on a second.
We got one more question.
One more question here.
Would you
Sure.
say the comparison of boarding schools being glorified stockades and slaughterhouses for dehumanized domestication of people like they were livestock is a fair analogy?
I would say that what we know is that these were not only atrocities, they're acts of genocide, and that is exactly why this has been a call to action at the level of the United Nations, specifically looking at how and what forms of treatment and abuses occurred. And again, this is why we need to continue to support and uplift this movement.
Okay, marvelous. Thank you so much. That's quite a moving response there. It sort of it was almost hard to listen to in some cases there. But Joannie, once again, thank you so much, and to the good luck to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, in its work. It's so important right now and has such an effect on our people. So once again, we want to say Mado, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And for anybody that wants to join our movement, you can become a member. Visit boardingschoolhealing.org, support Senate Bill 1723, and also the time for healing and justice is now. Thank you.
Mado.